Hello, this is Patrick Manyak. I am here to provide a little introduction video for the 5720 Literacy Difficulties class and the second module, which addresses RTI systems of instruction in reading. I think this is an exciting module, and there's a lot of exciting research out there on RTI or MTSS systems, and a lot of very promising research that we'll read about during the module. So I want to keep this brief. I'm going to make 6 key points and share a few findings from research studies as I go, and then leave you with a couple of sort of really practical takeaways at the end. First, we know that there are research models of RTI systems in reading that have been highly effective in terms of accelerating lower performing students' growth in reading such that they catch up to a normal band or to their peers. Now, many of those research examples do include special resources that aren't available to our regular public schools. So maybe a couple of graduate assistants who are actually teaching intervention groups or something like that. But we also have research, and you'll read some of it if you're in the primary level, where we see schools with just typical public school resources make some really great gains, some great successes in terms of their MTSS and reading programs. I'm thinking of the model schools in Connecticut, who certainly had a close collaboration with researchers from some of the universities there, but they didn't rely on university resources. So we know that RTI systems can be very helpful in terms of intervening with struggling readers and actually making accelerated growth. Now, point 2 is that RTI structures or MTSS structures themselves don't guarantee highly effective instruction or that accelerated growth. It should be no surprise that poorly implemented RTI models don't have great results. We have good evidence of this from the National RTI and Reading Study conducted in 2015. They surveyed programs across the country and then actually conducted research with kids who were in interventions, tier 2 and tier 3, and very comparable peers who did not receive interventions. The way they did that is they sort of drew a cut line, let's say the 33rd percentile, and they used kids in the treatment group who were 33 and below, and right around that actually, 32, 33%, and kids in the control group who were at 35, 36%. So they were highly comparable kids, but the former received intervention, the latter didn't. This study looked at a lot of programs, a lot of kids in grades 1 through 3. They found that the kids in the interventions showed no significant benefits in 2nd and 3rd grade on a variety of tests of reading, and in some crazy way actually scored worse than the kids who didn't receive the interventions in grade 1. So that was not wildly optimistic, and it basically tells us that the vast majority of RTI programs in reading are not doing what the research models were doing. They are not sort of replicating the kinds of implementation in those very positive model schools, and they are not, having the same kinds of outcomes. One super significant, finding from the surveys in this sense is that in 2/3 of the schools, the reading interventions replaced some of the core instruction in reading. So you did not get that powerful 1-2 punch of really strong tier one classroom and targeted classroom instruction with intervention on top of it. And when you think about what we're trying to do, we're trying to get kids who, for some good reasons, were performing lower than their peers and growing slower than their peers to actually grow faster than their peers, such that they may catch up growth. You start to think like, yeah, it is going to take excellent classroom instruction with very intensive intervention stacked on top of that. And that simply wasn't happening in the majority of the program schools in the study. All right, so here's point 3. The early studies in RTI, and really it continues on now, really emphasized the critical nature of tier one core instruction, classroom instruction. To the number came back with that as a key sort of takeaway or finding that effective RTI programs in reading really require, highly effective tier one classroom instruction. You've probably heard the percentage that in general, it's been suggested that tier one instruction should kind of move ahead 80% of the students, within a normal band. It should be sufficient to reach 80% of students. It kind of makes sense, if you have 100 students, let's say across, the first grade or first and second grade, you're hopefully moving 80 of those on, leaving 20 in need of intervention. If that percentage drops, and now we're only meeting sort of the needs of 50% of students with classroom instruction, now we have 50 students who need intervention. And it becomes difficult for intervention to truly function as it should, as intervention, in terms of really bringing increased intensity of instruction and increased commitment to mastery for students if those numbers are that high. Furthermore, we've already said, if we're going to really expect lower performing students to outperform higher performing students, to make that accelerated catch-up growth, we need that sort of 1-2 punch of excellent targeted classroom instruction plus intervention. And finally, of course, even when we are successful and students exit intervention, now their fate moving forward is tied solely to classroom instruction. And if that's not very strong, you can see that we're going to probably see those kids again in intervention and maybe others besides. All right, so it's just so critical, and the studies have underscored we have to get classroom instruction in reading and writing and so forth right. We have to have really excellent tier one instruction for any of this then to work. All right, here's point number 4. And that is that we have seen in the research studies that tier 2 instruction in reading can use core classroom materials, but just sort of teach them with greater intensity. That usually comes, of course, with reduced group size and that greater commitment to mastery. That was an open question early on and still for a lot of schools in terms of tier 2 intervention. Well, can we do what we do in classrooms, but just sort of, it's a second dosage and it's in smaller groups and we spend more time and we're really committed to kids mastering it? Or do we need something that is a special sort of intervention program? And, when that was tested, when the research schools used core programs with that greater intensity and greater commitment to mastery, they found that it was successful. I'm not saying that's the only way to pursue tier 2 intervention. A lot of schools, of course, have invested in or have interventions that come along with core programs. And there's a good chance that those would also be highly successful. I'm just holding out the research finding that tier 2 can be in use sort of classroom materials. All right. Now, point 5, and this deals with secondary. Secondary, you're going to read about some of these things in your text, just like elementary is going to read about some of those earlier points. What we've seen is basically pretty mild benefits from RTI systems and interventions in reading. I think, we'll read about the Vaughan and Pyle study where what we saw is a 0.16 effect size. So 0.16, almost 0.2 of a standard deviation. That's not negligible. It was a significant finding, but it definitely is considered mild. It doesn't even meet the moderate sort of effect size, which would be 0.2 to 0.5 of a standard deviation. And that effect size versus the controls actually resulted in the decline in performance of the controls over time, and not the intervention students actually making catch-up growth toward sort of that normal band of students. So, what we saw is sort of the normal students and the intervention students kind of getting back on parallel growth rather than catch-up growth, whereas the control students were actually sloping downward. They were declining through those, in this case, middle school years. Now, researchers have held out the idea that, no decline is significant. If that of course, we would love to accelerate those lower performing students such that they regained a normal band. But no decline still means something. If it leads, let's say, to high school graduation versus decline, which may not. So it may be at the secondary level that we literally just, we have to think about goals and sort of look positively on the sense that maybe what we can do is help kids who are struggling, not to decline. Versus higher performing students, and that is a positive outcome for our intervention. All right, here's point 6, the last point, and that is, and you probably all live this, that these interventions should not be considered an inoculation, one and done. We should expect students who, excuse me. Sorry about that. We should expect students who have been in, let's say, early reading interventions and exited them successfully, regained that normal band. We should expect some to reappear and need further interventions, let's say, in later grades. Gilbert and the Fuchs, kind of powerhouse team of scholars in this area of RTI, they provided a 14-week, so kind of a shorter term, 14-week intervention in first grade. They found that 53% of the positive responders from that intervention were back in intervention at some point up through third grade. So half of the kids that did respond positively and join the normal band needed further intervention at some point across second and third grade. And that's just has to be an expectation. That's been largely seen across studies and across different programs. And anyone that would sort of sell itself and saying this is an inoculation, if they go through this program, they'll never need further, intervention in the future, I wouldn't believe it. And we understand that, right? The task of reading changes as students move up through the grades, and you have new challenges and new obstacles that confront these kids that their earlier interventions didn't necessarily address. All right, so here's 5 practical points to wrap this up, and this will be brief because some of them really just repeat what I've already shared. First is that, I'll make the point again. We have to get tier 1 classroom instruction right. That it really, it's nothing else works if that's not working. Either we're flooding interventions with too many students, or we're not getting that powerful 1-2 punch that combines strong classroom instruction with strong intervention instruction that it takes to make catch-up growth. Number 2 is that time on task is super critical here in terms of intensity. We can't have those programs where the intervention actually cannibalizes the classroom reading instruction time. It takes that 1-2 punch, and we've got to be able to work out schedules creatively where intervention is truly supplemental and doesn't sort of replace core instruction. The national study indicates, that just wasn't enough. Okay. Practical point number 3 is that it's another variation of the time matters, and this one has to do with timing of beginning or early intervention, which is that starting in kindergarten, let's say mid-year kindergarten, produces better outcomes. More kids reach a normal band as they move forward than starting in first grade. So earlier is better. That's a point that's open in the threaded discussion right now in the first module. It's never too early to start trying to slip in sort of supplemental instruction for kids who appear to need it. All right, point 4 is that focused intervention that addresses key needs seems to produce better outcomes than more sort of general multi-component programs. Now that changes a little bit as you move up the grades, and especially as you get towards the upper elementary and secondary, where kids do have needs across kind of the components, from word reading to reading fluency to comprehension to vocabulary and so forth. There, I think it's necessary to think about sort of multi-component intervention. Nonetheless, even there, and certainly in the lower grades, if we have kids who struggle in word reading, it makes sense to really have targeted intervention in word reading. And then if they move on from that, then we have targeted intervention in fluency. All right, so focused intervention that really meets key needs. And that might just simply be another way to say this stuff has to be intense. Because if we start chopping up intervention time across a lot of components, we're losing intensity in, say, a key critical needs like word reading. Okay, and my final point is to our secondary folks, and I've already made it, so I'll be brief, which is that maybe it takes a little revisioning of the goals of intervention in reading at the secondary level, where keeping students from further declining and just producing that parallel growth that isn't necessarily catch-up growth, that's good enough. Or at least that we're always going to strive to do better, but that may be realistically, about the best we can do. But it also may get a lot of kids to the finish line in terms of high school graduation, and then maybe even community college, enrollment and so forth. All right, I hope these points help. You're going to revisit a lot of them as you read and as we talk, and I look forward to that in the coming days. Thanks. Bye.